Alright, so let's talk about Assassin's Creed series and naturally start with the first one. The game that kicked off one of the biggest franchises in gaming. I played this one during its release and couple times after it, even lately, and honestly it has aged a bit, but I can see why it's considered so important. I actually have played the whole series passionately and always enjoyed myself more or less. The moment you boot up the game, you're introduced to this whole sci-fi meets history thing, which I wasn't expecting first time I launched it. I had only seen trailers of the historic gameplay. You start off in this weird futuristic lab, and it turns out you're actually playing as this guy named Desmond in the present day, and he uses this machine called the Animus to relive the memories of his assassin ancestor, Altair. This idea was pretty cool at the time and gives the game a unique angle. The story itself follows Altair, a member of the Assassin Brotherhood during the Crusades, and it's pretty straightforward. Hunt down 9 key targets to stop them from spreading evil and messing up the world. Simple, but effective enough to get you going. Now, what really makes Assassin's Creed stand out is its parkour, combat, and stealth gameplay. Moving through cities like Jerusalem and Damascus is where the game shines, especially for the time. You can climb almost anything in the environment, which was super refreshing and innovative at the time. Running across rooftops, leaping between buildings, and using the crowds to blend in. It makes you feel like a proper assassin. There's a flow to the movement that's satisfying once you get the hang of it and know what parts are climbed which way. But here's the thing. The parkour, while cool, doesn't always feel as smooth as I'd like by today's standards. Sometimes Altair just doesn't do what you want, like jumping down instead of reaching up from ledge or awkwardly clinging to a wall. And it can get frustrating. Still, for a 2007 game, this level of freedom was groundbreaking. The combat system is pretty basic. You have a sword, a dagger, and your hidden blade, which is the most iconic part of the game. You'll mainly be fighting guards, and the combat after a while starts to revolve around counterattacks. It's satisfying at first. You feel like a badass when you pull off a perfect counter and take out enemies with a single blow. But after a while, it starts feeling repetitive. There's not much depth to it. You wait for the enemy to attack, counter, repeat. It doesn't evolve much as the game goes on. Stealth plays a big role, obviously, and sneaking around, blending in with monks, or hiding on benches is cool, although a bit silly at times, but it's pretty surface level compared to later games. The idea of social stealth was unique at the time. You could hide in plain sight by acting normal, which felt clever, but there's not much variety in how you approach each assassination. Most of the missions boil down to the same formula. Find your target, blend in, and stab. Rinse, repeat. The setting is fantastic. The cities are beautifully recreated, and you really feel like you're in the middle of historic avenues. The attention to detail is impressive, from the architecture to the crowds of people going about their daily lives. Climbing the highest tower in the city to get a panoramic view and then performing a leap of faith into a haystack is one of the most iconic things in gaming, and it mostly doesn't get old. Yet it will after a couple games. Another strength is the overall concept. This was a fresh take on open-world games. You're not just roaming aimlessly. You've got targets, and each city has its own vibe, so exploring feels purposeful. And while the missions might be repetitive, each assassination gives you this tense, cinematic moment of stalking your target and then executing them. The atmosphere is also top-notch. The ambient sounds, the chanting of monks, and the bustling marketplaces really sell the world. I was totally immersed in the setting even if the gameplay started to feel samey after a while. As much as I love the idea of the game, the gameplay loop gets really repetitive and fast. You're sent on these little mini-missions to gather intel before each assassination, and they're basically all the same: eavesdrop, pickpocket, beat up a guy for info. After you do this a couple of times, it starts to feel like busy work. I found myself rushing through them just to get to the assassination itself. The controls, while ambitious, feel a little clunky sometimes. Like I mentioned earlier, Altair doesn't always do what you want him to, which is super annoying when you're trying to make a quick getaway or pull off a slick assassination. And the combat is just not deep enough to stay interesting for the whole game. Also, the story, while decent, doesn't hit as hard as later entries in the series. Altair's character feels kind of flat. He's stoic and cool, but I didn't feel much emotional connection to him. Desmond's modern-day story doesn't really go anywhere in this first game. In the end, Assassin's Creed 1 is definitely worth playing, even if it's just because of what it started. It lays the groundwork for some incredible ideas that get much better in the later games, but on its own, it's a bit rough around the edges. The parkour and the open-world design are great for their time, and the game's atmosphere and concept are really strong. But the repetitive mission structure and shallow combat hold it back from being truly amazing. If you're a fan of the series, or you just love open-world games with stealth mechanics, it's worth checking out to see where it all began. So after going through the original Assassin's Creed, which, let's be honest, felt a bit like doing the same thing over and over, I jumped into Assassin's Creed 2 with rose-tinted optimism. And man, was I blown away. It was even better than I remembered. If the first game was like a proof of concept, Assassin's Creed 2 is where they took all those rough ideas and actually made something special. Right from the start, the game makes it clear it's going to be a different experience. This time, you're playing as Ezio Auditore, who is just miles more interesting than Altair. Like, I actually cared about what happened to him. The story kicks off with Ezio's life as a carefree young noble in Renaissance Italy, and it does a great job of building his character. He's charming, kind of reckless, and you immediately get drawn into his world. But then, everything changes when tragedy strikes his family, and the well-known revenge story kicks in. This emotional core gives the game a much-needed depth that the first game lacked. You're not just hunting down targets because it's your job. You're doing it because you care about Ezio and his journey. Let's talk about gameplay, because this is where the real improvements come in. Assassin's Creed 2 basically takes everything the first game did and makes it better. The parkour is smoother and more fluid. Ezio moves around with more finesse than Altair ever did, and the cities of Florence, Venice, and the Tuscan countryside feel more alive and vibrant. Climbing buildings feels less frustrating, and you're not constantly fighting with the controls. The open world is also more dynamic. In the first game, the cities felt like beautiful playgrounds. Here, they're bustling with activity. There are side missions, collectibles, and random events that make the world feel more lived in. And thank God they fixed the mission variety. In AC2, the missions are way more diverse, with assassination contracts, races, courier missions, and even puzzles that tie into the lore of the world. It's just way more engaging overall. The combat system, while still focused on counterattacks, is much improved. You've got more weapons to play with now. Swords, hammers, hidden pistols, and even dual hidden blades. The fights still revolve around timing your counters, but it feels less repetitive because of the variety of enemies and weapons you can use. And you can actually disarm enemies now and use their weapons against them, which adds a nice layer of cool factor. One thing I dislike, though, is the economy system. It quickly turns into a monopoly where you just buy everything and get everything. AC2 introduces this whole concept of upgrading your villa, buying new gear, and investing in shops around the city. It gives you a reason to collect money and a sense of progression outside of the story. This sounds good on paper, but like I said, it turns out to be your infinite money glitch. There are so many things that Assassin's Creed 2 does right. First off, the setting. Renaissance Italy is just a great idea for a setting. The detail in the architecture, the vibrant colors, and the way you can interact with historical figures like Leonardo da Vinci is just awesome. Climbing to the top of buildings here makes it feel like wide, open world done right. And speaking of Leonardo, the fact that he acts as your personal engineer is a nice touch. He builds gadgets for you, like your hidden gun, and even a flying machine for a couple missions, and this relationship adds a lot of charm to the game. The story is also a huge win here. Ezio's personal journey, from a cocky young man to a seasoned assassin, is satisfying to watch unfold. His character actually develops over time, unlike Altair, who felt kind of static. And the supporting cast, like your Uncle Mario, adds even more personality to the game. Another thing I loved is how the game leans into the historical conspiracy stuff more than the first one did. There's this whole codex system which unravels the mystery of the first civilization, and it ties into the whole overarching Assassin's Creed lore in a way that's really intriguing. It makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than just a revenge plot. Now, it's not all perfect, of course. There are still a few hiccups here and there that I already mentioned, like the whole economy system. For one, the controls, while better than the first game, can still feel a bit wonky, especially when you're in a tight spot or trying to escape a bunch of guards. I had a few moments where Ezio would randomly jump in the wrong direction or cling to a wall when I needed him to drop down. Similarly how the first game had problems on this area. It's not as frustrating as AC1, but it's there. Also, the combat, while improved, can still get a little too easy once you've mastered the counters or simply use a smoke bomb and assassinate everyone. By the end of the game, I was mowing through enemies without much of a challenge, which makes some of the later fights less exciting. The story is great, but there's a lot to do in between the main missions, and sometimes it can feel like the game's trying to pad out its length. I didn't mind too much because I enjoyed the world, but I could see how some people might feel like it drags in the middle. Lastly, Desmond's modern-day storyline is still kind of boring. It's more fleshed out than in the first game, and you get more insight into the whole Templar versus Assassin conflict, but it still feels like a side note compared to Ezio's story, which is where all the fun is happening. Assassin's Creed 2 isn't just a step up from the first game, it's a leap. It takes all the potential of the original and refines it into something genuinely memorable. The world is gorgeous, the story has heart, and the gameplay is finally as fun as the concept deserves. It's the game that made Assassin's Creed a franchise worth following during that time. Sure, it's got a few rough edges, but those are easily forgiven when you look at the bigger picture. If you're new to the series or felt let down by the first game, this is the one to play. It's no exaggeration to say that AC2 laid the foundation for everything the series would become in the years to follow. Ezio is probably also on the cooler side of what main character can be. After playing Assassin's Creed 2, I was quite hyped for Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Ezio had cemented himself as one of the more charismatic protagonists in gaming, and we just spent hours roaming the beautiful streets of Renaissance Italy, stabbing corrupt nobles and hanging out with Leonardo da Vinci. So when Brotherhood dropped, overall, I wasn't disappointed. But it definitely felt more like a long expansion pack than a brand new game. First off, Brotherhood picks up right where AC2 left off. Ezio's back, and we're still in Italy, but this time, the action is focused almost entirely on Rome. The story opens with a bang because the villainous Borgia family decides to attack Ezio's home, and things go south quickly. Suddenly, you're rebuilding the Assassin Brotherhood from the ground up. I like that Brotherhood had this immediate action. The stakes felt personal for Ezio, and you've already grown attached to him. And now it's about reclaiming what's been taken from him and the people he cares about. Brotherhood takes the core of AC2 and builds on it, rather than reinventing the wheel. The big new mechanic is you actually get to build your own Brotherhood of Assassins. Throughout the game, you recruit citizens of Rome who are oppressed, and you can send them on missions across Europe to gain experience and level up, or call them in for support during a fight. It adds this awesome new layer of coolness. There's something super satisfying about whistling and watching a group of your assassins swoop in from the rooftops to take out guards. It makes you feel like an actual leader, not just a lone assassin. The parkour and movement mechanics are largely the same as in AC2, which is a good thing since they were already quite smooth. But at the negative side, it carries same old issues. The game also streamlines the combat system. Ezio can chain together kills much faster now, which makes combat feel a lot more fluid. It's less about waiting for counters and more about going on the offensive, chaining executions from one enemy to the next. It's a small but important change that makes fights way more dynamic. Another significant addition is the Borgia Towers. These are strongholds scattered throughout Rome that you need to liberate by killing a Borgia captain and then burning down the tower. Once you do, you unlock that area of the city for rebuilding, which ties into the game's economy system. You can invest in shops, banks, and landmarks, much like upgrading your villa in AC2, but on a larger and better scale. It's actually quite satisfying to watch the city come to life as you take back control. One of the biggest strengths of Brotherhood is its tight focus on Rome. Unlike AC2, where you were bouncing between multiple cities, here you have one giant city, and it feels incredibly detailed and alive. From the Colosseum to the Vatican, there's so much history packed into the city, and the sense of scale is impressive. Plus, having a single city allows the game to feel more cohesive experience. You're not constantly traveling between regions, and the map design feels more intricate. The Brotherhood system is definitely the game's biggest innovation. Recruiting and managing assassins is super fun, and it adds a lot of depth. It makes you feel like the head of a real organization, and calling in your squad to take down enemies never gets old. There's a real satisfaction in seeing your recruits grow from novices to master assassins over the course of the game. I also appreciate that Brotherhood continues to refine the little details, like improved combat animations and better mission variety. The missions themselves are more varied, and the addition of optional objectives for full synchronization, like don't get detected or finish in under 5 minutes, adds a new layer of challenge for completionists. It keeps things fresh and encourages you to approach each mission with a bit more strategy. That said, while Brotherhood is great, it's still very much built on the foundation of AC2, which means some of the same issues carry over. For one, while Rome is a beautiful and detailed city, it can start to feel repetitive after a while. You're basically operating in one location for the entire game. And while it's huge, the novelty can wear off compared to the variety of AC2's multiple cities. The story, while solid, doesn't quite have the emotional weight of AC2. Brotherhood feels more like a continuation of his story rather than a major turning point. Also, while the Brotherhood system is cool, it can sometimes make the game even easier than it was. Once you've got a group of high-level assassins, you can call them into deal with almost any problem. It's great for power fantasy, but it removes the challenge. I found myself relying on them a lot, which can make the game feel a bit too automated at times. Lastly, Desmond's modern-day story still doesn't steal the show. The balance between Ezio's story and Desmond's progression feels a bit uneven. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood is a fantastic follow-up to AC2. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it polishes and expands on everything that made AC2 great, while adding some cool features like the Brotherhood system. The city of Rome is breathtaking, the combat is more fluid, and leading your own team of assassins feels incredibly rewarding. It's more of the same in the best way possible, with just enough new mechanics to keep things fresh before Revelations. After playing Brotherhood, I was pretty excited for Assassin's Creed Revelations, and it was kind of a letdown. I mean, this is the game that promised to wrap up Ezio's story and give us some closure on Altair, the OG assassin. But with the series starting to feel like an annual affair at this point, I was curious to see how much it would actually push the formula forward. And after playing it, I'd say Revelations is a bit of a mixed bag and maybe even leans on the bad side. It's like they're trying to tie up loose ends while adding in some fresh mechanics, but not everything hits as hard as it should. Right off the bat, you can tell this game is about closure. Ezio is older now. He's not the carefree assassin from AC2 anymore. He's grizzled, a bit worn down, and he's on this final mission to uncover the secrets of Altair's life, all while trying to find his own peace. The game's plot revolves around Ezio trying to unlock a series of Masyaf keys that will let him access Altair's hidden library. Along the way, we get flashbacks to Altair's life, so Revelations really brings Altair's story full circle, which is something I appreciated. Let's talk about what's new in terms of gameplay. Revelations introduces a few new mechanics to shake things up, but whether they really work is another question. The biggest addition is the hook blade. This is essentially a modified hidden blade that lets you zip line across the city or extend your reach in combat. Zip lines make traversing the city faster and more dynamic, which is great in a place like Constantinople where you've got a lot of verticality. But it's not a game changer. It feels more like an upgrade to your toolkit than a revolutionary new mechanic, and after a while, it becomes just another way to get around. You can craft all sorts of bombs, lethal, tactical, distraction-based, using ingredients you collect throughout the city. And while it's cool in theory, I found myself only using a handful of the bombs. It's one of those systems that feels a bit over-designed for its own good. It's nice that it's there, but it's more of a side feature than a core part of the gameplay. Combat is mostly the same as Brotherhood. The counter-based system returns, but it feels a little smoother. Chaining kills with the hook blade is satisfying, and there's a bit more enemy variety, which keeps things fresh for a while. Still, by this point in the series, the combat is starting to feel a bit too familiar. Once you get the timing down, Ezio becomes an unstoppable force. A big change that I quite much hated is the den defense minigame. At certain points in the story, Ezio has to defend assassin dens from waves of Templars in this tower defense style game. You place assassins on rooftops and barricades on the streets to fend off enemy attacks. The game tries to be this strategic experience, but the controls are clunky, and it feels like a weird diversion from the core gameplay. It's one of those mechanics that just didn't need to be there, and I found myself dreading whenever a den defense sequence popped up. As for Altair, we finally get more of his story. Through flashbacks, you see him struggle with leadership and betrayal within the Brotherhood, and it humanizes him in a way the first game never did. I wasn't expecting to care much about Altair, but the way they bring his story full circle is really well done. The setting, Constantinople, is stunning. The city feels again alive with its bustling markets, towering buildings. The visual design really nails the historical atmosphere, and climbing is just as epic as you'd expect. The game's world building is on point, as always, and it keeps that sense of adventure alive. Revelations isn't without its drawbacks. For one, it's clear the formula is starting to show its age. The parkour, combat, and mission structure feel largely the same as the last two games. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, it does make the experience feel a bit too lazy. There are fewer new mechanics or big innovations to really shake things up. The hook blade is fun, and bomb crafting is cool, but these features feel more like incremental updates than groundbreaking changes. This again making the game feel more like an expansion pack than its complete game. Then there's the den defense stuff I mentioned earlier. It just doesn't fit. It's a clunky, out-of-place distraction that pulls you out of the immersive world, and I found myself actively avoiding it when I could. Another downside is the mission variety. While the story can be engaging, the actual mission design can feel a bit repetitive. It's a lot of the same tail this guy, assassinate that guy type of missions with less variety than Brotherhood offered. And since the main innovations like bombs and hook blade don't radically change how you approach objectives, some missions end up feeling like a rehash of what we've done before. Finally, the modern-day Desmond story. While it still feels a bit disconnected from the rest of the game. Sure, we get more insight into Desmond's past, but the modern-day segments still feel like they're holding back. Assassin's Creed Revelations is a solid entry in the series, but it's not the groundbreaking leap that Assassin's Creed 2 or Brotherhood were. Instead, it's more of a thoughtful conclusion to Ezio's story, and in that regard, it absolutely delivers. Watching both Ezio and Altair's journeys come to a satisfying close is easily the best part of the game. That said, the gameplay is starting to show its age, and the new mechanics don't do enough to freshen up the formula. The game's beautiful setting and strong character-driven story keep it engaging, but by this point, the core Assassin's Creed formula feels like it's due for a change. After Assassin's Creed, Revelations the series was moving away from Renaissance Europe and into the American Revolution, which was a bold leap. Plus, we were getting a brand new protagonist in Connor, which I personally think is one of the best AC main characters. Introducing a Native American as a playable character was a gamble, which paid off. I can see how this could have rubbed many people in a wrong way. It's set in the late 1700s, and you play as Connor Kenway, a half-British, half-Native assassin who gets caught up in the revolution while fighting for his people's survival. The story is sprawling and ambitious, covering everything from Connor's childhood to his role in the war, and it takes you from bustling colonial cities like Boston and New York to the vast wilderness of the American frontier. Though with all this storytelling comes so boring segments, especially how long the game's intro can feel. You play as his father, Haytham Kenway, for the opening act. This feels a bit odd of a choice as it takes several hours to get out of the intro. The game spends so much time setting up Haytham that Connor's introduction feels a bit abrupt, and it took a while for me to really get invested in him as a protagonist. He's a more serious character than Ezio, but shares the cool and mysterious traits with Altair. Historical backdrop is incredible. The way the game weaves Connor into real historical events, like the Boston Tea Party, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, is seriously impressive. You really feel like you're in the middle of this massive historical moment, rubbing shoulders with figures like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. It's one of the things Assassin's Creed 3 absolutely nails. In AC3, the main introduction is that wilderness is now part of the game and not just a means of traveling from location to location. Connor's parkour skills have been adapted to fit this new setting. So instead of just climbing buildings, introduces traveling among the wilderness, such as climbing trees and jumping from tree to tree. It's a really fresh take on the series' iconic movement system, and it adds natural movement that was not realized in previous games. The way Connor moves through the natural landscape feels fluid and dynamic, and it's one of the game's standout features. Combat also got a slight overhaul to be more aggressive, as the main character is. Combat is now more offensive-focused, and not as much countering, though, that still does exist. Connor's fighting style is brutal, combining tomahawks, hidden blades, and firearms. New combat lets you string together attacks more smoothly, though the system feels a bit more streamlined and less reliant on waiting for enemy attacks. It's fun since you can tear through waves of enemies without breaking a sweat. Another major addition is the introduction of naval combat. You take control of a ship and engage in naval battles, guiding your ship through rough seas, positioning it for a perfect broadside, and watching the enemy's ship get destroyed under your cannon fire is one of the more impressive additions to the game. It's one of those features that felt so polished and fun that it made me wonder why it hadn't been a core part of the series sooner, and of course, this laid the groundwork for Assassin's Creed 4, Black Flag. The game does a fantastic job of immersing you in the period. From the streets of colonial Boston and New York to the vast wilderness of the frontier, the world feels alive and meticulously crafted. The game's weather system, which brings snowstorms, rain, and fog, adds to the atmosphere, especially when trudging through snowdrifts or stalking prey in the woods. Hunting is another new feature, and it's surprisingly well done. You can track and hunt animals, example deer, bears, and wolves across the frontier, and there's a whole system for trading and crafting. It's a nice little side activity that ties into Connor's background and adds a bit of depth to the open-world exploration. In terms of narrative scope, Assassin's Creed 3 is ambitious. This causes the game to sometimes drag, but other times shine even brighter. It tries to tell a story that spans decades and weaves Connor's personal journey with the larger events of the American Revolution. While Connor is nowhere near as liked by many as Ezio was, he's still a compelling character in his own way. His struggles with loyalty are central themes, and his interactions with historical figures make for some interesting moments. AC3 brings a lot to the table with its positives, but where it drags is the story as mentioned before. The first hours playing as Haytham are quite well-paced, but when the change to Connor happens, it feels extremely slow for a good while before you learn all your skills as an assassin. The missions themselves can also be hit or miss. While there are some standout moments, there are plenty of slower, more tedious missions that involve eavesdropping, tailing enemies, or long-winded conversations. These mission types have been a part of the series since the beginning, but by the time AC3 rolled around, they started to feel very tired. I often found myself wishing for more action and less walking slowly while listening to a conversation. Another issue is Connor himself. Although I like him as a character, he is nowhere near as charismatic or humorous to follow as Ezio. In AC2, Brotherhood and Revelation's long conversations felt much more interesting due to the charm Ezio often brought there. Connor is a well-created character, but he takes things often in very serious style. Desmond's story is also at its end here, and it tries to be a huge things, but in the end, I just can't care about the modern-day story enough. How games after this develop the modern day is, in my opinion, better, as it doesn't feel as necessary and can be often skipped faster. Assassin's Creed 3 is a game full of ambition and new ideas, and while it doesn't always stick the landing, it still delivers a memorable experience. The setting of the American Revolution is fresh and exciting. The frontier and naval combat are fantastic additions, and the game's scope is impressive. Connor's journey, while more serious than Ezio's, still has its compelling moments, especially as he navigates his place in both the revolution and his own people's fight for survival. However, all the long-term issues seem to be still in this game from the previous ones, such as movement sometimes, not doing what you wish, padded out length, and the way game almost forces you to do side events. Coming off the heels of Assassin's Creed 3, I was extremely interested in a naval-focused Assassin's Creed that is pirate-themed. Black Flag feels very little like an Assassin's Creed, but excels as a pirate game. The game doesn't just build on the naval mechanics from the previous entry. It makes them the central focus, transforming the series into an open-world pirate adventure, and it's one of the most refreshing entries in the series to date. You are once again charismatic character Edward Kenway, a pirate who becomes embroiled in the Assassin-Templar conflict by accident. Edward is the grandfather of Connor from AC3, but personality-wise, he's about as far removed from Connor as you can get. Where Connor was serious, Edward is goofy and works mainly towards fortune and fame. He's not a traditional assassin, and that gives Black Flag a very different tone. The game is once again, like many previous ones, stunning. Set in the golden age of piracy, the Caribbean is your playground. You sail between iconic pirate havens like Nassau, Havana, and Kingston, and the game captures the atmosphere of the time beautifully. White sandy beaches and bustling port towns to mysterious jungle islands and shipwrecks. The world of Black Flag feels alive and endlessly explorable. The setting is so vibrant and full of character that even when the narrative dips in quality, the world keeps you hooked. Story itself is not that memorable, but the open sea world is. Edward's adventure on the sea is fun to watch and play. Black Flag is much more about the journey and having fun on the sea with your ship than end goal. Game majorly takes place at sea, and I think it's one of the few games where water is actually a fun environment. Naval exploration and combat are no longer side activities. They are the core of the experience. You spend a huge chunk of the game captaining your ship, the Jackdaw, sailing from one island to the next, engaging in ship battles, plundering forts, and exploring hidden coves. The naval mechanics, which were just a taste in AC3, are fully fleshed out here. And they're fantastic. Controlling the Jackdaw is smooth and intuitive. You feel the weight of your ship as you navigate through stormy seas, but it also doesn't feel too realistic and leans heavily on the fun side. Lining up broadside shots with your cannons, or maneuver into tight spaces during chaotic naval battles. The sea combat is exhilarating. Firing off volleys of cannon fire, boarding enemy ships, and looting their treasure never gets old. Every encounter at sea feels dynamic and unpredictable. But it's not just about sailing. Once you've disabled an enemy ship, you can board it, which triggers these fun, chaotic sequences where you leap from the ship to opponent's ship. It's a seamless blend of the naval and on-foot mechanics, and it keeps the action feeling fresh. These are almost like small deathmatch arenas. On land, the core Assassin's Creed 3 formula remains. You still get the parkour system, stealth mechanics, and assassination missions. But the game's land-based sections aren't quite as strong as the naval portions. Free running is mostly same as in the previous game and works fine in the jungle settings. There's again the same mission archetypes of tailing, eavesdropping, pickpocketing, etc. But there's a lot of missions on the sea also. Hunting animals is majorly the same as in previous game. One of the cool new additions to hunting is harpooning, which lets you hunt massive sea creatures like whales and sharks. It's a fun little side activity that adds to the pirate fantasy, though it's not as deep as the core gameplay loop. Sheer freedom you have in Black Flag is incredible. The open-world nature of the game really shines here, as the Caribbean is vast and full of things to do. Whether you're plundering enemy ships, exploring sunken wrecks, or sneaking through dense jungle ruins, there's always something new to discover. The world feels alive in a way that previous entries didn't quite manage. Storms roll in dynamically. Sea shanties fill the air as your crew sings while you sail, and you're constantly coming across new islands to explore or treasure to find. It's a game that encourages you to just get lost in the world, and that's one of its greatest strengths. And where there is crafting for your person, you can also craft and upgrade your ship. You can upgrade the Jackdaw in a couple of ways. Stronger cannons, more durable hulls, faster sails, and even cosmetic changes like new sails or figureheads. These upgrades aren't just for show, either. You'll need a fully decked-out ship to take on the notorious legendary ships, which are some of the game's best challenges. Edward himself is also a refreshing change of pace as a protagonist. He's a pirate first and an assassin second, and his motivations are much more self-centered. His arc is all about learning the cost of his greed and coming to terms with his role in something much larger. It's not as emotionally heavy as Ezio's journey, but it's compelling in its own way. Edward's interactions with historical pirates like Blackbeard, Charles Vane, and Bonnie are a lot of fun, and the game really nails the pirate Brotherhood vibe. But where the naval setting works great, the mechanics are still same old on land. Tailing missions, in particular, start to feel like a chore after all these games. I get that these are staples of the series, but in a game that's all about freedom and open exploration, being forced into scripted eavesdropping or following enemies from the shadows feels rough. These missions break up the flow and don't mesh well with the rest of the game. While Edward is a great character and his pirate adventure is fun to follow, the Assassin-Templar conflict feels like it's taken a back seat. I mean this in a good way. Edward's journey is hindered by the Assassin-Templar conflict. Edward's story is at its best when it's working with his needs and motives. Then there's the problem with open-world games. Repetitiveness in and while hunting, plundering, and exploring islands are fun, but they don't evolve much over time. You can only raid so many ships and explore so many locations on map until it becomes a work. Assassin's Creed 4. Black Flag is a breath of fresh sea air for the franchise. It takes AC3's naval combat and makes it into a full game in best way possible. While gameplay on land is mostly the same that it has been for the series so far, navigation on sea and the pirate setting are definitely wins here. Assassin's Creed Rogue is a bit of an odd in the series. Released alongside Assassin's Creed Unity, which was released on next-gen consoles on Xbox One and PlayStation 4. Rogue stuck to the older formula and appeared on the previous generation's hardware, and was last in the old AC formula. Shay is an interesting and quite likable and easy-to-understand main character. Quite early Shay's realization that the assassins are causing more harm than good sets him on a path of betrayal. He switches sides, joining the Templars and hunting down his former comrades. Seeing the world of Assassin's Creed from the Templar point of view is one of the most interesting aspects of Rogue, and Shay's moral struggle is at the heart of it. It's a great exploration of the gray areas in the Assassin-Templar conflict. Rogue feels like a watered-down Black Flag, an upgraded AC3. In fact, it directly connects to both games. Environments and gameplay feels like a mashup of the two. It's a cool connection for longtime fans. But the downside is that Rogue often feels more like an expansion to Black Flag rather than a full-fledged new game. Similarly, how Brotherhood and Revelations felt to AC2. If you play Black Flag, Rogue will feel pretty much the same on the naval part. You still upgrade and sail around doing small stuff and destroying other ships. Though now icy waters, you get a couple new upgrades to the ship like a small prototype machine gun to target ships' weak points and burning oil to destroy following ships. The icy sea of North Atlantic is quite filled with icebergs and such for frozen loot or to damage nearby enemies by sending smaller icebergs on their way. There's also small frozen environments you can explore, similarly to small islands of Black Flag. On land, the game follows the classic Assassin's Creed formula: stealth, parkour, and assassinations. You'll explore major cities like New York, and the layout and mission design feel very familiar. New York is pretty much a reskin of the city from Assassin's Creed 3, and while it's fun to explore, it doesn't offer much in terms of innovation. The same goes for the stealth mechanics. They're solid, but unchanged from Black Flag. Since you were playing as a Templar, You are now often target of assassins. This is actually quite interesting and fun mechanic, as enemy assassins now stalk you in hidden spots you hid in previous games. There is audio cues and visual cues to tell you that assassins are near or show their hiding spot, and this can make the game a bit more tense at times. Assassins also are quite deadly compared to regular enemies. Although Rogue falls a little flat on the gameplay systems, its story excels. Seeing the story from the Templar side, whom so far have always been portrayed evil, is interesting and shows that the assassins might not be on the right side either. It turns the tables from black and white to gray and gray. Being the last of the classic AC games, it ties up the stories of Black Flag and AC3 while connecting itself to the next-gen AC game Unity also. Naval combat stays the same as in Black Flag, so pretty fun through and through. The new couple upgrades and hazards of frozen seas and cold water bring a bit of threat to the sea. While Rogue has a strong story and some neat mechanics, it's hard to shake the feeling that this game is a rehash of last two games. It borrows so much from Black Flag and AC3 that it honestly feels like an expansion. It also isn't as large as previous games in its content. The land-based gameplay is also starting to show its age. The parkour and stealth systems haven't evolved much, and while they're still functional, the environment doesn't really work for an assassin style of movement. I know you were playing as a Templar, but since Shay was trained as assassin and his movement skills are on par with them, more environmental movement would have been nice. Assassin's Creed Rogue is a unique entry in the franchise, offering a fresh perspective by putting you in the shoes of a Templar for the first time. Shay's story is compelling, and the game does a great job of exploring the moral gray areas of the Assassin-Templar conflict. However, Rogue doesn't quite escape the shadow of Black Flag. The game borrows heavily from its predecessor, and while that's not necessarily a bad thing, it makes Rogue feel more like an expansion or a side story than a full-fledged new entry. Gameplay on land also feels worse and more poorly designed by every title. That being said, if you're a fan of the classic Assassin's Creed formula, Rogue is a worthy send-off. It ties together several loose threads in the series' lore and delivers a solid, if familiar, experience. It may not be the boldest or most innovative game in the series, but it's a fitting conclusion to the original style of Assassin's Creed before the series evolved into something new.